just bear with me for a sec. I'm just going to move everything around. All right. So today, what we want to do is we want to have a look at intents. So an intent basically is used for messaging within our current activity. We can send a message either within our app or we can send it to another app on the device. So what does this look like kind of practically? So implicit intent, we've got two kinds, implicit and explicit. And implicit intent is used when it doesn't matter to us which particular app runs it. So for example, if we want to load a web page, we're going to use an implicit intent because we might have multiple browsers on the phone and we don't really care if that web page loads in Chrome or loads in Firefox. Whatever the default app is can handle it. You know, we may have different email clients, so same thing. We want to generate an email message from our app. Maybe we're using Outlook, maybe we're using Gmail, maybe we're using another kind of app. So the implicit intent, we're saying what kind of action we want to perform, but we don't care what app is actually going to do the action. So we're going to use implicit intents. And then an explicit intent is when we know exactly which component is going to perform the action. So that might mean that we're pointing to a specific third-party app on our phone, or more commonly, we use explicit intents to navigate within our app. So this is how, when we have a multi-activity app, we use explicit intents to open one activity and display it. So when we've, thanks, Hayden. So when we're using an explicit intent, we're specifying a URI. So what resource are we invoking? The context of our application, and then what component is it? So typically this would be, if we're loading a new activity, that component is going to be that new activity we want opened. Okay. So our code will look something like this. Let's say we've got an activity, we've got a main activity, and we have a detail activity. Here's going to be our syntax. We create a new intent. And in Kotlin, you may remember from our first week, we said we don't actually need the new keyword to call a constructor. We just set a variable, we create an intent, and the two required parameters are the context. So typically that's our app. So within our app. And then we're calling, and this syntax is kind of funky. Here would be our detail activity, : class.java. So we create the intent object, and then the method we use to actually execute the intent is start activity. So we start an activity and we pass in this intent object. We should probably look at this syntax a little bit. It's kind of funky. Has anybody seen this double colon before or know what it does? So I've included a link here in the week 4 folder with a bit of a description of what this does. Okay, yep. So a little bit different in Kotlin. So there's a good kind of description here. Okay. So the double colon is basically used, and we'll look at the Kotlin docs, it's used for reflection. And our good description is here. So it's basically a runtime reference to a class object. Okay. So in this case, we've got our detail activity class. So it's a runtime object within our same project, but we also have this .java. Anybody want to guess why do we have the .java? The reason is under the hood in Android, it still basically runs on Java. So in order to invoke this class, even though it's a .kt, it's written in Kotlin, the class object itself at runtime. Yes, basically. I thought I had the link to reflection in Kotlin. I want to pull that up here. I should include this link. I thought I had this link in the lesson 4 folder, but I will add it. Okay. So here's our explanation here. Okay. So we're reflecting on our class, but to obtain a Java class reference, we need the .java property. So we're going to need to use this syntax when we're navigating from one activity to another. Everyone's going to need this in their assignment because pretty much almost everyone's app proposal includes multiple activities where users can navigate backwards and forwards through the app. If we want to close an activity, we can just call finish. And we looked at the backstack last week. So if we want to go back, we just call finish, and that destroys our activity and loads the previous activity. We looked at this last week as well. So when an activity is hidden by a new activity, it's not destroyed, it's just paused and stopped. Okay. One of the other things we want to do when we use intents is often we need to pass data to them. So maybe we're moving from, let's say, a master activity to a detail activity, and the detail activity needs to know which record, which item did the user select, so we can populate the detail activity. So we have this object called an extras object, which is basically a key value dictionary. So here we're creating a new intent to load our detail activity, but before we invoke the intent, we use the method putExtra when I'm defining a key called URL, and then I'm providing a value. So this means we will have access to this URL key in the detail activity. If we want to read the value, so this is writing it into an extra, we use putExtra. To read it out, we would use our intent, and then if the value was a string, we could use the method getStringExtra. So this will take the extra, treat it as a string, and then we could render it or work with that value. So this is how we could pass data from one activity to the next. And we'll do this today. Okay. So implicit intents, again, here's kind of a visual. We're on like a Google Maps, and we click website. So the browser that loads, we don't specify open Chrome or open Firefox. We simply say open a web page, and then it's going to use the operating system's default browser to perform that action. One of the other things that we'll have to consider are permissions and protection levels. So some intents require certain permissions to be declared and others don't. So Android kind of divides these into protection levels, and you can read more about it here from the official docs. But the gist of it is we have normal protection levels. So these would be accessing things either within our own app or things that Android considers low risk. So for example, opening a web browser considers a low risk activity. So no explicit permission is required for us to use an intent to, for example, open a web page in a browser. We have signature permissions. We don't use these very often. So these would be that the app is granted permissions during the installation, but only for permissions that are signed by a certificate with the same developer as our app. So we don't use that very often. So basically for accessing some custom library that you also create. The last set of permissions are what Android considers dangerous permissions. This would be when an app can access resources or private data, or it might affect the effective operation of other apps on the device. So something like reading a user contacts would be considered dangerous permissions. And to set these, we have to explicitly require permissions at runtime. So we do this in the Android manifest. Yep, sure thing. So we have this uses permission tag where we can define explicit permissions. So these permissions are actually also displayed in the Google Play Store. So if I go to the Play Store and search for an app, in the app definition, let's search for, I don't know, maybe in the app description, it tells us which permissions on the device are required by the app. So these permissions basically come from this declaration in the manifest. Okay. So we're going to play around today with both. We're going to start with implicit intents. So we're going to basically do three things. Landon, that's a really good question. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I would think that would fall under dangerous, because those resources, when it talks about accessing resources or data, Google basically looks at privacy and says, are there potential privacy considerations around those resources? So my best guess, I don't know for sure, but my best guess is we're talking about an SD card that would be accessing private data. So that would fall under dangerous permissions. So in that case, we would explicitly need the user's permissions in our Android manifest. And that way, when a user installed the app, they would get a prompt telling them this app can access your SD card. So they would know this at the time they install the app, or when they run it for the first time. I'm not 100% sure, but based on the documentation, the documents aren't great in that they don't explicitly set out a chart saying these permissions are normal, these are signature, these are dangerous. We can actually have a quick look at the docs. Oh, actually, okay, sorry, it does say, let's check the permissions API. It does tell us here. Okay. So here's our permissions. I'm not sure that it breaks them out. It says it does. But I'm not sure. Okay, so you'd have to go into each individual one. So it tells you the protection level. So if we looked for, I'm not sure if there's a read SD permission. I have to look through the various permissions in order to determine that. So what we want to do, we're going to use a really simple implicit intent, how to navigate from one activity to the next. That's number one. Then we're going to use extras. So not only can we move from one activity to another, but we could pass data along with it. Then we're going to use an implicit intent. Okay, thanks, Bikramjit. So it would be under external storage permission. And yeah, that would be considered dangerous, and you would need explicit permission to access the external storage. For sure, you would. So we'll start with explicit intents for navigating within our app. Then we'll try using an implicit intent. We'll look at, for example, launching the browser. And then if we've got time, I'll maybe give you one other activity, one other task. I'll put you in small groups, maybe in breakout sessions, and you can try to solve using an implicit intent. So let's go to Android Studio. That's a really good question, Lyle. Thanks for that. And thanks, Bikramjit, for the note. So I'm going to make a new project for today. I'll use empty activity as my default project template. I'll call it Fall 20 Lesson 4. And I'll just accept the rest of the options. Kotlin as the language. I'll accept the recommended API, the suggested API, SDK. And we'll start it up. Pardon me. So we'll let Android Studio build out our template app. And then as soon as it's ready, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a second activity. And then we can add some buttons so we can navigate between the two activities. So here's our main activity. And we get our hello world text view as usual. So right away, I'm going to create a second activity here. So I can just click on File, New, or actually probably easier just in my project, in my Android view, I'll right click. Maybe I don't want to do it this way, sorry. I'm going to choose my project view up here. That makes it easier. Okay, this is what I wanted. My project wasn't built yet. Sorry, so in my Android view, if I go to expand my app and resource, if I right click layout, now what I want is a new activity. And I'll pick a second empty activity. So sorry about that. I'll leave the menu open. So in the Android view, I right clicked RES and layout, and then I'm going to choose new activity, empty activity. I'm going to give this a name of detail activity. And I'll click finish. And if I open up my Android manifest, we'll see that we've got two activities here. And my main activity has this intent filter. I think we looked at this already last week. So the intent filter that is in our main activity basically indicates that this activity is our launcher activity. When the app starts, this is the first activity. Okay, good question, Hayden. So yeah, there's different naming conventions for the resource files and the classes. So the class name is going to match what we called it in the wizard when we built it. However, the structure of all resource files is that all the XML files in Android and all the XML nodes within Android, such as our strings, the naming convention is all lowercase with an underscore. So it's just the naming convention Android uses. There's no real reason why it has to be this way, but this is what Android Studio will do automatically for us. So basically, the simple short answer is it's the convention. So what we want to do is just add a simple, yes, that's right. Well, if we look at the class is called detail activity, right? So that is the official class name. It matches with the Kotlin file. So the word activity doesn't totally get ignored, no. So in our activity main, I'm going to go to my designer. I'm going to delete the text view that's here. And I'm going to add on a button. So I'll add a button on. I'll call it detail button. And I'll just center it for now. So Kartik, aren't you proud of me? I'm just using the visual constraints just so I can click and drag. And now it centers it. And then I want to change the text on my button. So if I just click on it again, in the text property, I can click the little rectangle here and I can create a string resource. So I'll click that, it brings up my pick a resource dialog box. And if I click the plus sign here, I'm going to create a new string value. My resource name, all in lowercase. And I'll just put in the text with a couple of greater than symbols. I'll run the app quickly just to have a look at it. So basically, we just have a button in the middle that says details. It's telling me I should update my Android, my adb.exe. That's okay. I'll ignore that message. Yeah, Tim, I'll look at it. There may be something we need to update on that. If I find something else we need to update to make that error go away, then I will let you know. I'll leave it for now. We're almost due for a break, not quite. So here's how it looks. When I click my details button right now, I get nothing. I'm just going to maybe add something to we'll maybe just add a text view to the details. And then we'll add a simple intent that when the button is clicked, it'll open up the detail view. So I'm going to go into my detail activity, and I'll maybe just put on a text view. I'll call it heading text view. Whoops. And we'll anchor it to the top. And I'll just set out a couple of other properties. So I'm using 0 as my start, top, and right constraints. It says text view, so I'll just create a new string resource. I'll call my resource name detail heading. This is the detail activity. And I'll maybe change the font. And I'll maybe change my text size. We'll make it bigger. So we'll set up a Demens resource with a larger font. So I'll scroll all the way down to the text size. And I'm going to create a dimension value. We'll call it heading size. And we'll make it 22 SP. So we're using SP, scale independent pixels, for text. Okay. So at the top, it'll say this is the detail activity. We'll take a break in a minute, but we want to write our click handler with our explicit intent. Okay, so I've added a text view, and I've used 2 resources. So now I'm going to go back to the code in my main activity, and we'll write a click handler for our next button. Okay, so we've got a button on main activity, and we just have a label, a plain text view on our detail activity. So I'm going to go to the main activity. So we're going to use an intent. This will be an explicit intent to load the details activity. It's explicit because it's within our own app. We're going to specify exactly which class is going to be used to perform the intent. So we're going to set an on-click listener for our button. Create a new intent using our app's context and the detail activities Java class object. So we're going to create an intent within our own app. So that's our application context. And our second parameter is our detail activity. And we're using that double colon, this reflection. So we can inspect our own class at runtime, .class, .java. We're missing a reference here. So we can do Alt-Shift-Enter, or I can just use the code hint here. We need to import android.content.intent in order to use intents. So most of our activities are going to use an intent of some kind. So we're probably going to wind up importing that into most of our activities. And then we just call start activity and pass our intent object. I've thrown the code in the chat, assuming your button is called has an ID of detail button like mine. So I'm going to run the app again. And now when I click my details button, this should take me to the detail activity. And our button should disappear and we should see our little label at the top. So now when I click details, it opens the new activity. Our main activity is still present, it's just in the back stack. So if I click back in my emulator, it brings me back to this activity. Okay. So I know that people are asking, they're saying, I'm concerned about my assignment. I need to know more things in order to build the app for the assignment. I know you do. So we're going to work on these things over the next few weeks. I'm going to try to give you the most important components that you'll need in order to be able to build your app. So obviously everyone's app is different, but using intents, navigating through the app, and then invoking other components on the device, these are critical things, and we'll do these things today. Okay, it's 12:02. Sorry, that's a little bit longer than I would have liked to have you sit. Let's take a 10-minute break here, and we will come back in 10 minutes, and then we'll look at extras, and then we'll look at implicit intents. Yeah, I will create a new Git repository now and share the code. I did just put it in the event handler you needed in the chat as well, but I'll push the whole thing to GitHub. Just give me a minute.